You're listening to Lucid Cafe. I'm your host, Wendy Halley. And we're back. I had a dream recently where everyone was 43% less full of shit. It was delightful. And then we all had ice cream to celebrate. Speaking of celebrating, I think I should get a trophy for being the king of flawless segues. Anyway, speaking of celebrating, Mitch Horowitz is on the show. I bet you're asking, how'd you pull that off? Well, I simply asked him if he'd be willing to come on the show, and he said yes. And then I said, uh-oh, I better increase my dose of smart pills. Mitch is a fascinating guy to talk to, and I could have talked to him for hours and hours. Considering how busy he is, I would have been thankful for just 5 minutes. But he was really kind and generous with his time, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. He's also very professional, which really highlighted my lack of professionalism and maturity. But it was totally worth it. If you're not familiar with Mitch's work, let me get you up to speed. He's a historian of alternative spirituality and one of today's most literate voices of esoterica, mysticism, and the occult. Mitch illuminates outsider history, explains its relevance to contemporary life, and reveals the long-standing quest to bring empowerment and agency to the human condition. He's widely credited with returning the term New Age, one of my favorites, to respectable use, and is among the few occult writers whose work touches the basis of academic scholarship, national journalism, and subculture cred. Mitch is both a writer and lecturer in residence at the New York Public Library. He's a lecturer in residence at the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles and the PEN Award-winning author of books including Occult America, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life, The Miracle Club, and his latest, The Miracle Habits. Please enjoy my deep dive with Mitch Horowitz. Hi, Mitch. Thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so I have to say I am really psyched you're here, of course. I'm sure you hear this a lot, but I am impressed with your way of articulating these spiritual concepts that are difficult. And what I really appreciate is the unconventional way in which you approach these concepts. And I have to say, it's really level-headed.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're prolific. You have a lot of books out.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to talk about your miracle books, The Miracle Club and The Miracle Habits, which is your most recent, correct?
Yes.
So what do you mean by miracle?
It's a heavy term, and my definition is very simple. It is a fortuitous event that it exceeds all reasonable circumstance or expectation. And in that vein, miracles do occur. Things that we call catastrophes also occur. And I think everybody would agree that an individual's behavior can result in catastrophes. By the same token, an individual's behavior can result in miracles. We experience many different laws and forces, and I've never taken to the expression there are no accidents. I do believe that one can find meaning in a great many things and that there are many switchbacks in life which are there to teach required lessons. But are there accidents? I believe if one is subject to forces that are random, like geological or environmental forces, or wrinkles in biological or natural events, yes, there is a randomness. There are accidents. There are countervailing forces, sometimes social forces, that the individual faces that are overwhelming. So I would never suggest that everything that could be classified as the miraculous or the catastrophic is in our hands. But nobody would deny that certain behaviors lend themselves to catastrophe. By the same token, I think we must acknowledge that certain behaviors lend themselves to the miraculous.
And that's kind of the focus of the miracle habits, right? Or the behaviors that you think are most
That's right.
apt to lead to miracles.
For sure. Yeah.
It really reads like a way to be more ethical.
Well, I have to pay special attention to ethics because I also speak in terms of power. And when people hear the term power, they tend to think of brutality or force. And I use terms like power very freely. And it's very important that I be clear to those who really want to probe what I'm talking about, that I see power as a personal agency, as the ability to act on one's constructive and generative and productive drives, to see through some variant of what one wants in life. I think a lot of what we define as neurosis is just the frustration of personal power. I'm very comfortable using that word, but because that word is misunderstood sometimes as force or brutality, it's also important for me to clarify that I have a basic ethic of reciprocity. I think reciprocity is at the back of everything that we call ethics. Some people might use the term karma. Some people might use the term golden rule. I don't think either of those quite get at it for me in terms of my personal practice. I do think there's a human wholeness and that there is a basic, even one could say cosmic reciprocity. And it's partly why we feel so depleted, for example, after gossiping. If you watch yourself carefully, when you do something to another person, you'll feel the effects of it, even physically, if you're paying careful attention.
Absolutely. I feel like power is a super important concept. And I talk about it from the point of view of being in relationship with your power,
Yeah,
with your personal power.
yeah.
And like you're saying, it's not about having power over someone else. I mean, you can do that, but that would be not the most ethical use of your power.
Yeah, and I see power over somebody else, the desire, for example, to have other people obey us, which is probably the primary fissure of human nature. I see that more as force. It's not necessarily renewable. It's not part of any kind of a circuit of relationship or reciprocity. Most of what we see in our culture today that might be identified as power is force, which is just really compelling obedience. And if someone doesn't submit to us, if someone doesn't subject themselves, then we get punitive, and we get punitive in a hurry through social media. That's through humiliation, for example.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, in other ways, it might be trying to deprive people of their livelihood or something like that. So that impulse to want to be obeyed is probably the worst misuse of power. It's not power, it's force. And it's a very common aspect of human nature.
And then on the flip side, too, the unconscious willingness to obey. I'm a psychotherapist, so I see that a lot in the folks that are coming to work with me.
That's a good point.
Yeah, man, it's I'm really enamored with the idea of personal power. I think it's an important thing for us to have a right relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
A lot of your work, at least these two books, I haven't read every one of your books yet, but a lot of what you're saying, the idea of forming your reality or creating a reality, what do you subscribe to around that? Are you suggesting that we have some agency in steering our reality in a desired direction, or do you feel like we're actually creating our own reality?
That's a wonderful question. That really is at the heart of my search. It seems to me, and I'm going to speak very, very broadly, that even if mind is the ultimate arbiter of what we experience, even if mind is ultimately the creative force at the heart of all that is, we experience many different laws and forces. I used to say that we live under many different laws and forces, but I'm not sure that gets at it quite right. We experience many different laws and forces. And it may be that there is a thought self behind all that is. And yet, within the framework that we occupy, if I were to walk outside and stub my toe on something, I would feel pain. And there's virtually no exception to that for practical purposes. the physical forms that we exist in are going to decline. We'll experience mortality. There's never been any exception to that. And for practical purposes, we have to come to terms with the fact, obviously, that we experience many different laws and forces. Within that, I do think we have a law of, or a tool of mental agency that can help select and engage in circumstances. That may be the ultimate truth of life, and there's lots of reasons to believe that that's a very live prospect, and that's a very real prospect. But in terms of what happens on a given Tuesday at 2:30 in the afternoon, we are dealing with many laws and forces, of which the mind is one. And so I want people to never feel that they're without resources and without possibilities, because that ultimate reality is kind of like a signal in the noise. It's there, and the noise is there too. And the question is, can we experiment with it? Can we learn about it? And we're doing that certainly in many ways, both as individuals and as a human polity. I mean, we understand things today that about the mind that people didn't understand a generation plus ago. We understand through brain scans via the field of neuroplasticity that thoughts alter brain chemistry. That wasn't something I grew up understanding.
No.
That's not how things are supposed to work. The mind is supposed to be an epiphenomenon of the brain, not shaping the brain. You know, if one really were to take the implications of that data, which is not controversial, but really apply the implications, you're standing in front of a huge, epic upending of everything that we grew up understanding. So there's progress. You know, we are learning things about ourselves and the mind, both as seekers and as a human community.
Do you have any theories about what the mind actually is? Just a small question.
Yeah, right. Well, just a small question, right? Well, I, it's an interesting question because it's not a question that we ask enough. You know, I mean, here we live at a moment in the 21st century where everybody is all about artificial intelligence and talking about artificial intelligence. We don't even know what intelligence is. And, you know, here we are steaming, you know, full speed ahead into an era of artificial intelligence. And we understand that we, as a human species, are capable of creating self-correcting machines on a vast scale, and the possibilities are enormous. But we use the term intelligence too loosely. We don't know what intelligence is.
I sure don't.
Yeah, and
Personally,
if intelligence can, for example, localize a particle in a quantum physics lab, where before that particle existed only in potential, was in a wave state, and the decision to take a measurement or not take a measurement localizes that particle, thus creating a whole past, present, and future along with it. If intelligence can actually change your physical body, you know, I mean, we're experimenting with things in this age in placebo studies that go beyond the boundaries of anything that even the modern founders of that field would have understood, including placebo surgeries, including a whole wide range of other things that beg ultimate questions about the mind as a force, as a creative force. We just don't know what the mind is. We don't know what the mind is. And there's any number of vocabulary terms that I could throw out. There's any number of historical references that I could throw out. And I don't think I'd be getting to an ultimate place. I guess I would say we got to be real careful with our descriptions, because in the 19th century, for example, a lot of mystical writers would use the term soul. And I would get very frustrated because I would, you know, I'm very interested in the New Thought movement. I'm very interested in the prospect that thoughts are causative. And for that purpose, I go back to a lot of the early literature to see what our pioneers thought. And sometimes they'll just get right up to the door. They'll reach for the handle and then they'll use the word soul. And I'll say to myself, well, what is a soul? I don't necessarily know what that is, or that is a thing, or that is real. and hence nowadays that term is not used as regularly as it was then. It's still used, but we'll use the term mind or consciousness or intelligence or artificial intelligence. And I think the people who are using that language very often perceive themselves as ultra rationalistic, and they would give you an explanation of what intelligence is. It's a motor cognizant problem solving apparatus. Okay, great. That's one description among possibly many others, because one of the flaws, it seems to me, in our materialist model today, and there are several, including the fact that materialism has been repeatedly disproven and we haven't acknowledged it as a society, and probably won't in my lifetime.
There's that.
Right.
Yeah.
There's that. Materialism being the philosophy that matter just creates itself, and that the mind is nothing but an epiphenomenon of the brain. But then we see that the mind, what we call the mind, actually affects the brain. And so materialism has been upended in so many unacknowledged ways. But one of the things, so since it's still the sheriff in town, I have to deal with it. And one of the mistakes that sheriff makes repeatedly is the pattern, the thought pattern, committing the thought pattern that because we've grasped one verite, one reality, one fact, we understand the whole thing. So for example, the materialist critique of placebo studies might be, it's nothing but endorphins being released in the body. It's like, well, it may be. That may be one of 12 things that are going on. The release of endorphins or something else may be what the prayer response or the spiritual response looks like in the body. That's one thing that we've learned, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing occurring. So when someone says intelligence is a cognitive, motor functioning, problem solving apparatus, okay, granted, but what would lead a person to think that's the only thing that's going on? So we tend to find one truth and think we found all truths.
Nailed it. Yes, we do that for sure. Maybe I'm being too simplistic, but my interpretation of all of this it boils down to consciousness, and that it's, and that territory is huge and nobody understands what it is. We feel like we have a sense of self and a mind and all these things, but what does that even mean?
Yes.
My healing practice is based in Hawaiian or Polynesian philosophy and mysticism, and they believe that we don't have one soul, but we have three souls. And so the mind would be interpreted as the mental soul or the lono. And that is the inner director. That's the part of us that thinks. Our intellect, it needs logic to function. And then there's the body soul. That's when you stub your toe. That's the part of you that's going to repair and restore your body, keep your heart beating, your lungs breathing. It's the warehouse of your memories. It's the source of your emotions and feelings. And then there's the third soul, which is the higher self or the higher consciousness, the very wise part of us. And they would say it's an immortal aspect of us that's not human at all, that's dreaming us into existence, right? So again, from this Hawaiian perspective, one of the basic tenets of it is that the world is what you think it is. The world is what you think it is, right? So it's all based on thought. Everything begins with that thought. And I don't know if being a student of new thought, where do thoughts arise from? It's kind of mysterious. We can direct them, but you can really get caught in the weeds. But there's this, if you look at consciousness, these three aspects of self from this perspective I just shared, to me, each of these aspects are kind of operating independently. And the goal is to have them be aware of each other so that everybody's working together on the same team, rather than being driven by your body soul that wants nothing but pleasure and is your unconscious mind. Again, it's the source of all of those habitual behaviors and things that are fucking us up as we're living our lives. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Any thoughts on all that shit I just threw out there?
No, not at all. One of the things I wrestle with in terms of my search for the causative properties of thought is that emotions too are running off doing their own thing. And emotions, it seems to me, are vastly more powerful than thought. And so mind is saying, let's do this today, or mind is saying, now be reasonable. It's not that bad. And emotions are saying, I'm alarmed, I'm scared, and these things get wired into us. It's hard to understand sometimes where an impulse begins. I mean, the presumption in a lot of New Thought literature, including the literature of the pioneers, is that everything begins with a thought. I don't know if that's true. It may be, for example, that the body perceives things in its way before the mind does. And suddenly adrenaline starts pumping, and then thought comes in, just a millisecond later and says, hey, what's going on? Where's the danger? Or emotion perceives something, perhaps based on its memories that may or may not be there, but, and feels alarmed or distressed or something. And then, again, mind comes in a split moment later and says, what's going on here? And starts to interpret it. I'm not sure what's fastest, in our apparatus. You could make the argument that mind is perception, but intellect, emotions, body, they're all going along their own tracks. And I think probably
Exactly.
mind is the slowest of those three.
I would agree. Yeah, I would actually say that the part that's, at least from my experience, that higher intelligence, your higher self, whatever you want to call it, that's probably the originator of the thought, but it's not something where, I mean, I don't even know what that thought would look like, but that we are reaction machines, right? That our
Yeah.
bodies are just constantly reacting to our environment and our experiences. And then the mind wants to kick in and make sense of it and put it in a nice little box. Yeah, I agree with you. I think maybe that's what is meant by the world is what you think it is. It's more like your beliefs, your perceptions color your experience of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And they're super powerful in that way. But the part of us that's actually creating is maybe a part of us that we're not necessarily in touch with or aware of. Getting a little in the weeds there, but I don't know.
Well, one of the things I'm experimenting with all the time are the conditions under which mind may be able to select possibilities. And, if our senses are tools of measurement or instruments of measurement, and it could be argued that's exactly what they are. They're organic tools that measure things: smell, touch, taste, sight, sound. What we elect to measure, what we choose to measure, can be very powerful. It can be reality itself. And I think we've certainly seen evidence of that on a particle level. And the question is, are there exercises, are there methods that will put the mind or something else within us in the driver's seat, so to speak, so that we're capable of taking these measurements
More consciously.
More consciously. Maybe we can do that in a so-called hypnagogic state, where there's a kind of self-hypnotism going on. Maybe we can do that through vivid visualization. Maybe we can do that through affirmation. Maybe the simple repetition of something over and over eventually bypasses the emotional apparatus and takes charge. Maybe there's a nameless self behind everything that can talk to the mind, the body, the emotions, and say, look, let's all work together. And maybe once in a while, everybody will agree. Maybe you're trying to get these unruly parties on a camping trip together to say, I realize you all have things you want to do.
Yeah. Have you met each other?
Yeah, we are going to have to light a fire, or we're going to get cold, or we're going to have to get water because we're going to be thirsty. And let's try to work together. It falls to us, the individual, to experiment with this. I mean, the interesting thing about placebo response studies is that most of the time they're done with a kind of benign, benevolent deception. The individual believes he or she is receiving a treatment. You're getting a sugar pill, but you think you're getting some active substance.
Right.
You're In one particular case that was done at a veterans hospital, people received placebo surgeries, but they were getting a benign incision. And the body responded. The body responded. This had to do with a certain kind of knee surgery. And then more recently at Harvard Medical School, they did a transparent placebo study where they told patients that they were receiving nothing, but the placebo response was still triggered. So the question is, what methods do we possess that can trigger this kind of royal road to selection, to desired selection? I mean, certainly we're making undesired selection all the time. We have fears, we feel threatened, and it's very difficult for people. It's difficult for me. I mean, this stuff gets hardwired into us. And it also may be that there's kind of a dice roll. Some people are born, we see this in infants all the time. I've seen it in my own kids. A kid comes out of the womb, he or she, it seems to me, has these very inherent character traits. And where does that come from? One could say, oh, look, it's a biological roll of the dice. Another person could say, hey, there's a pretty good argument for reincarnation. Maybe there's a paranormal writer who's now deceased named Hans Holzer. And one of the things I dug about him, forgive me, this is a bit tangential, but if we're going to talk about where the self comes from, maybe it's a good point. Holzer said in his observation that many of us have the experience of spending our whole lives coping with certain habits or patterns. And we go to our therapist, we go to our friends, we go to ministers, we talk to ourselves, and yet certain things seem to trail us throughout life. And he said, if you use the principle of Occam's razor, whereby the simplest answer that covers the greatest number of bases is likely to be right, he reasoned that reincarnation is a pretty good bet, a pretty good gambit. Certainly our Vedic brothers and sisters who have been around for a long time, much longer than our Judeo-Christian culture, the world over, people have believed in reincarnation in one form or another. Eternal recurrence is a belief that you find extending way back through the ancestry of humanity across different continents, and languages, and cultures. And Holzer said, well, look, since we do seem to enter this life with a certain indelible range of traits, maybe that idea, which is vested in so many different religions of humanity, is correct. It's again, it does seem to conform to the principle of Occam's razor. Simplest answer that covers the greatest number of bases is probably right. This is speculative, of course, but I'm just super curious about antecedents, why one infant comes into the world trusting of strangers, lights up when a stranger walks into the room, and another infant will cry. And even if the stranger, him or herself, looks the same, presents the same, whatever it is, I think we've all observed that to some greater or lesser extent. And whatever those antecedent traits are that we seem to exit the womb with, they present a tremendous challenge in terms of, how we can navigate reality through the mind.
There was a lot of things that you said right there. All of them are compelling. I want to go down like every single point, but we don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
So let me shift gears a little bit and get back to what you were talking about around experimentation. And there are things that you said you're experimenting with.
Yeah,
I don't know if you're referring to the 10-day miracle challenge or...
Well, that's one. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that concept. And would you be willing to share a little bit about what that's about and how you came to it?
Oh, sure. There was one morning, I was in Boulder, Colorado for some television shoot, and I woke up hungover, and I felt...
Attaboy.
Yeah, right. A producer took me out to dinner the night before, and there was just too much alcohol flowing, and a good thing quickly becomes a bad thing. And so I woke up the next day hungover and depressed and headachy, and it was snowing outside, and I had to be at the studio in an hour, and I really felt awful. And there was some issue that was at the back of my mind that was really bothering me and troubling me. And just an anonymous person, a stranger, emailed me and said that she had never experienced any success with positive mind methods, and was there anything I could recommend? And I said, look, at this moment, you and I are both in the same boat. So why don't we just do an exercise together let's focus on a goal for 10 days and see what occurs. And these 10 days will be a kind of no holds barred situation. You can do whatever you want and mix and match as much as you want. Pray, visualize, affirm, write down, imagine scenarios, do spell work, do sigil magic, do whatever it is that you wish to do. And just mark off 10 boxes and check these things off. And I said, you don't need to tell me what your goal is. It's entirely fine that it remain private. In fact, I tend to really honor privacy as a general practice. And so we both did it. And I found that about 3 days into the exercise, I came to an idea that really helped resolve my issue as I was experiencing it. And what was interesting to me is that the idea was something that could be seen as pretty ordinary. And yet it was exactly what I was looking for. And so a component of this exercise, this so-called 10-day miracle challenge, is that you have to watch very, very carefully for the arrival of whatever it is you want. Because my contention is that we are dismissing amazing possibilities all the time because they don't look like whatever is in our mind's eye. And I think that we actually receive a lot of what we're going for, but we dismiss it or ignore it or overlook it because either it seems too ordinary, it announces itself in a way that seems very, very ordinary, or it seems too off-key, too unusual. It's not what we're looking for. Whereas we really can't control the way something reaches us. I think that things tend to reach us through established channels. We were talking earlier about Occam's razor. What's the simplest answer that covers the greatest number of bases? I can't necessarily control that. And so a person could be looking for a solution, and that solution will reach that person through some kind of established but possibly overlooked channel. So the 10-Day Miracle Challenge is an exercise in both mental causation, but also a heightened state of awareness. Really, really watching very, very carefully to see if the thing you're looking for reaches you. Because I think we overlook treasures quite frequently because they don't match our mind's eye conception of what we're after.
Well said. Absolutely. In that vein, have you ever, I'm just curious, used music as a way to help, use it as a tool, I guess, to sort of evoke a certain emotion, or maybe the music itself captures what it is that you're trying to bring into your life? Have you ever done that?
You're the second person this week to bring that up to me, and which tells me that this number is up. I need to make an effort in that area. I have not intentionally. Music is very important to me, but I have not used it as a tool, as a psychological or spiritual, by which I mean extra physical tool. And you're the second person who asked me that question this very week. So it looks like this is where I have to start experimenting.
Intuitively, years ago, there would be a certain song related to some goal I wanted to attain. And that song became meaningful around that goal. And it was evoked the emotion that would get me excited about that. Like there was some sort of weird connection with the song, and maybe nobody else would understand why that song. Because it's personal, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It was a really powerful way to get there quickly, emotionally. And it sounds like music speaks to you as deeply as it speaks to me. So yeah, that's one of the things I like to experiment too, is just throwing in the music bit, like trying to find maybe just one track that really captures the whole vibe of what I'm trying to bring into my life.
That's wonderful. I think I need to work with that more. I have not worked with music as a tool, and since this is coming up twice this week, it seems the time is now.
All right. Really quickly, can you just touch on the concept of selection versus manifestation?
Right. I don't use the term manifestation myself, as you just alluded. I use the term selection. Like references to the soul, like references to the mind, I find manifestation just unclear. And my contention is, and I write about this in the Miracle Club, that it's possible that we are selecting experiences, we are selecting reality as we live it all the time, that this is a constant ongoing process, and that the tools, the technology of selection are our senses, our sensory experience, including thought, including expectation. And my contention is that in a laboratory, for example, the clinician will use whatever tools he or she has available to take a measurement. And we have seen, as a matter of incontrovertible fact, in the past 90 years or so of quantum physics experiments, that the taking of a measurement is the only thing on the subatomic particle scale responsible for the localization of an object. Otherwise, that object exists in an infinite number of places. It's in a so-called wave state or a state of infinitude or whatever metaphor you want to use. They're all just metaphors. But the fact is, the subatomic particle is measurable in one specific place only when the decision is made to take a measurement. So are we making selections ourselves through measurement, through the technology of our senses and of our perceptions? These are tools, these are instruments. We use these things to navigate what we consider to be reality. And so that's a question that I have, because I felt it was an obligation, and I think it's an obligation for every generation to at least make an effort to try to explain what's going on. What's the delivery mechanism? We think something is happening. Well, what's the delivery mechanism? What's the delivery mechanism when there's an anomalous transfer of information in a laboratory setting, or what we would call ESP? What's the delivery mechanism if there is such a thing as mental causation? What's the delivery mechanism when the placebo response occurs? It may be wrong or it may be partial, but I do think that every generation has to at least try to grapple with that question. So that was my attempt to grapple very directly with the question of what's occurring if the mind makes things happen. And so selection is my preferred term versus manifestation.
I love it. No, selection, it speaks to more agency.
Yeah.
Manifestation is, I mean, that's another loaded word.
Yeah, it sure is.
All right. So there are about 7 million things I wish I could have talked to you about. One of them I really wanted to talk to you about, your perspective on evil. Maybe some future time you'd be willing to humor me and come back on and talk about evil.
Well, I could give I believe in answering things with as much brevity as I can. So I'm happy to say something about that. On the scale of the human psyche, I see evil as the measure of empathy versus spite. I mean, empathy and spite seem to me to exist on a continuum within the psyche of every individual. And rarely is the individual at one extreme of that end or another, although it certainly does occur. And in many situations, based on the degree to which we feel threatened or some other factor, we slide back and forth on that scale. But in terms of good and evil in the individual, the difference there, the measure, is really empathy versus spite.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So it's a human condition. And I guess what I was curious about, do you believe that there is a force, an external force that's not related to being human, that you could consider an evil force out there in the ethers, in the universe?
That's an interesting question.
It's kind of a big one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big one. I mean, what we in the West have labeled as the evil force, I think, has been misunderstood. And I see it, parabolically, the force that we call evil or the satanic or what have you, or what later came to be associated with those terms, is on exposition in, say, Genesis 3, where the snake in the garden supposedly tempts Eve into eating an apple. My interpretation of that foundational Western parable is, in fact, that the snake is a liberatory figure that instills judgment and the capacity for measurement and creativity. and friction, and friction. Whether there is, there are all these energies, it seems to me, all these possibilities that exist within our world, forces seen and unseen, but many, many different forces experienced. I don't necessarily perceive the existence of a force that moves the individual towards evil. I do think that certain individuals, whatever names or badges or labels they're proud of wearing, whatever they claim fealty to, whatever pictures they happen to hang up in their home, certain individuals are more climatized to the psychology of spite. They want to make somebody pay, and they're utterly persuaded of the rightness of their position. There's not a violent person on earth, who's not persuaded that he or she is committing acts of violation against another person for some greater good. They're absolutely justified.
Absolutely. I was just going to use the word justification. Yeah.
Absolutely. So everybody, if somebody walks by a window and throws a rock through that window, that person is utterly persuaded that he or she is doing the right thing, and could defend that action, if asked to. And
they'll have a whole story about it.
Yeah. And so, would have a whole psychology and a whole story. So some people are more acclimated to compelling obedience, violating other people physically or emotionally, and then telling stories about why that's necessary. We all have physical and extra physical lives, it seems to me. I think less in terms of the individual being under the sway of one energy or another than I do think of the individual for whatever reason. It may be fear, or it may be something other than fear. It may be the thrill that comes from compelling obedience, which is a thrill, in its way. People get a big, big charge out of making other people do things or punishing other people if they don't do things. There's a certain prurient thrill in that.
Right.
It comes back again, to this scale of empathy and spite. So I don't think frequently in terms of evil on an ultimate scale or good on an ultimate scale. And I think very few of us experience these things on an ultimate scale. Everybody always wants to take questions of good and evil and sort of make them into these big macro questions. And, of course, the joke is, and unfortunately the joke is true, every argument online always ends usually 5 beats away from where it began, with someone accusing someone else of being a Nazi or Hitler or the equivalent thereof. And to me, these things are a joke because most of us in our day-to-day lives do not deal with ultimate questions of good and evil. And I think if we're going to be serious people, it behooves us to deal with questions that we really face. It may be that we need to consider these larger questions, and I'm not saying we should turn our gaze away from them. But in terms of really assessing who we are, what we're about, who am I? Who am I in relationship to other people? Let's grapple with those questions on the level that we really live in, which is usually very ordinary in terms of our actions. That's why certain things, certain traits that might be seen as very elementary are very important to me. Do you show up on time? Do you keep your word? Are you capable of watering a houseplant? Are you, if you tell your best friend Mike that you're going to help him move, can Mike count on you that you're going to be there at 2:00?
Integrity, yeah.
And these are very big questions to me because they are where we live. And we are able to always persuade ourselves that we're participating in some larger drama, whereas it's the people with whom we're in relationship that's the drama. That's what we're participating in.
The reason why I asked the question is because the evil question, I'm with you. I don't buy into the idea that there's an evil force out there. I've investigated. I haven't seen any evidence of it. But a lot of people subscribe to that idea, and that gets back to that relationship with power. It puts them in a position of being powerless, right? If there's an evil force out there inflicting harm upon me, cursing me in some way or whatever, then I am powerless to it, and therefore I have something to blame rather than taking responsibility for why it is that I'm being harmed. And that's the shitty things happen because shitty
Yeah.
things happen.
And more often, since heaven forbid any of us should ever take responsibility for anything, we project the evil force, of course, as being somewhere else. It's always the other person. So
Exactly. Yeah.
it's witches in the Middle Ages or whatever, or it's the Illuminati or it's John Podesta or, whatever it is, it's always the other guy. It's always the other
Right.
guy. So the idea of there being an evil force is kind of a vanity that elevates the person who's making the judgment call as to where the evil force is. No one ever looks in a mirror and say, wow, maybe it's me. It's always conveniently somebody else. And
Yeah.
the somebody else is usually some figure that's imagined or dreamt up, or it's usually someone who's defenseless. And
Could be aliens.
right. So we project whatever it is, when we're analyzing these questions, there's almost zero authentic self-analysis. The evil force is always conveniently someone else who's not listening to us, who's not obeying us.
Well said once again. So I want to thank you deeply for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. It was a fun conversation.
Likewise. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Well, that was cool. I highly encourage you to check out any or all of Mitch's books. They're thought-provoking, well-written, and really accessible. I've included a link to Mitch's slick new website, mitchhorowitz.com, in the show notes. And again, a big thank you to Mitch for coming on the show. And thank you to you for listening and for spreading the word about Lucid Cafe. It really means the world to me. Until next time.